Well, hello, boys and girls. How are our graduate students today? Overworked, underpaid, underprivileged as usual? All of the above. I'm sure that's the case. Well, we're continuing our conversation this week with talking about managing environmental quality. Last week we were discussing what the rules were and what is our master metaphor for this course. The rules matter. So we discussed the Environmental Protection Act, the Environmental Protection Agency, air, water quality standards, and certainly toxic and hazardous waste. Well, now we're going to discuss how does one manage environmental issues in a business enterprise. So, of course, it's true that all business involves some degree of risk, right? And so most businesses purchase liability and medical and other types of insurance. So, for example, workman's compensation, which is businesses are required to have. And usually they pay a state workman's compensation insurance agency a premium. And certainly unemployment compensation is another form of insurance that companies have to have besides, of course, liability insurance. So these, of course, workers' comp and unemployment are required. Now, while liability insurance is not necessarily required, of course, just like driving without automobile insurance or not having homeowners insurance, that obviously defies reason, right? So clearly, insurance is a business necessity, and business premiums are set according to risk, right? How much risk does the business pose in terms of potential claims? So clearly, it's in business's interest to keep litigation and insurance claims low. And so, it is true that a number of businesses, which we're going to, talk about. So, for example, the BP Petroleum, company, British company, that had the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, they were what's called self-insured. Some companies elect to self-insure, that is, set aside their own resources in the event of claims. And so BP is certainly one of those who've done that. Clearly, high-risk activities, business activities, usually result in high premiums. The number of claims, of course, also affect, premiums. I like to advertise my 6 P's. Previous planning prevents pitifully poor performance. Now, why is that important? Well, I think it's important because of Murphy's Law. What is Murphy's Law? Given the opportunity, something will go wrong. It invariably does. Now, clearly, BP did not want or even foresee their oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Exxon didn't foresee or anticipate their supertanker running up on the Prince William Sound back in the late 80s, causing enormous environmental damages. But let's face it, in business, accidents happen. They're part of life. And so you've got to practice the 6 Ps to keep from going out of business. And so it's true. There is nothing more frustrating for business than failure to prevent a foreseeable accident or occurrence. So certainly the best managerial practice is checking, inspecting, and correcting for potential liability accidents. So as you read in preparation for today, your railroad creosote case is an example where, it's foreseeable that communities like our Bhopal, India prior discussion will grow up around industrial and business locations. City growth is just a fact of life. Let me give you a practical illustration. Disney World. Believe it or not, Walt Disney, who founded, of course, the Disney Corporation, and his first theme park that he built was Disneyland, which is in Anaheim, California. He wanted to build a much larger park in Orlando, Florida. Now, back in the late 70s, when he started purchasing land there, he foresaw that Orlando would expand, it would grow. And so in anticipation of that, he purchased a gazillion acres of land to provide not only a buffer zone between the park, what was going to be his new theme park in the city of Orlando, but also giving him room for expansion. And his foresight back in the late 1970s turned out to be truly prescient. So there's an example of where he was looking to the future and anticipating what are the things that might possibly affect his business in a negative way. And certainly local community growth certainly can present problems for a business operation. Now, we previously discussed in agonizing detail the Environmental Protection Agency and the federal government, but there are state agencies that fulfill similar practices. In South Dakota, it's our Department of Natural Resources that also polices business operations. Now, how does both the EPA, in our case DNR, how do these agencies assess potential danger of a business enterprise? Well, it conducts first a hazard assessment. Why is a hazard assessment important? Because it tries to establish the link between business substances, let's say, for example, coal emissions, and disease. Is there a relationship between coal emissions and cancer or respiratory illness? Well, there's a lot of scientific proof to show that there is. These agencies use animal tests to try and establish this practical link. Studies and statistical surveys are done to show relationships between human health effects and environmental exposures to identify potential hazards. So dose response assessment is done. The EPA uses a linear dose response rate between risk and exposure, meaning that, look, risks rise in proportion to exposure amounts. That makes sense, right? An exposure assessment is a study of how much of a substance humans absorb through inhalation, ingestion, and skin absorption. So that's how the government tries to determine the risk characterization of a particular, business's operations, if it involves emissions of any type, or water or air quality discharges. So once the risk has been identified, then of course efforts need to be taken to ameliorate it so that it doesn't create problems for people who inhabit and live in the area. So clearly coal plants, which are used certainly for generating utilities, pose an interesting air environmental hazard. And so the Environmental Protection Agency has issued from time to time rules for what's called maximum control technology, that the best control technology that is out there needs to be used in order, so for example, like coal scrubbers, to scrub emissions before they are emitted into the atmosphere to take out the particles that obviously, once they get into the public airstream, could pose hazards to the general public. Certainly there are legal considerations, that require, the review of environmental laws and regulations as they apply to the business and the hazards that it may produce. As I mentioned already, the best control technology uh, is sometimes required depending on what type of emission or discharge the company is engaged in. And then, of course, there's always the issue of economic and social factors that analyze on a cost-benefit relationship, the business uh, value versus the community and the impact on it. And of course, you're all familiar with cost-benefit analysis. You should be. So it uses the systematic identification, quantification, and monetization of social costs and social benefits. Obviously, to see, look, is the proposed emission, does it, in the long run, cost more, or in the final analysis, produce a better benefit and less harm? So certainly there are controversial assumptions and opinions about trying to monetize human life and environmental, features. And so certainly if there's any pollution of any type at all, you certainly are having a trade-off, right? You're having a trade-off of, okay, if this business is going to emit or discharge this pollutant, is the impact on the environment, to obviously include humans, reasonable or acceptable under the circumstances? And so there are attempts to try and put dollar amounts on environmental goals, sometimes called contingent valuation. How do you determine this? Well, the public is asked from time to time to make comments on, so how much are they willing to pay for untraded goods, such as the environmental quality of their community. So, for example, some years back, we had a oil refinery company called Hyperion from Houston come up here to South Dakota, and they wanted to build a $1 billion oil refinery about 10 miles here from Vermilion and in Union County, just adjacent to our Clay County. And think about it. A $1 billion oil refinery. We had to ask ourselves the question, of 50 states in the Union, why did Hyperion come to South Dakota? Why didn't they go to Oklahoma or California or Texas or Louisiana, where there are already lots of oil refineries? Well, because they were highly regulated in all those places, and they wouldn't be permitted to build yet a new oil refinery plant. Well, in the final analysis, there was a lot of pushback from our community, too, on that issue. And fortunately, the price of oil went through the floor, so the proposal died a natural economic death. But it certainly awakened us to the issue of, geez, who likes living next to an oil refinery? Let's see a show of hands out there, boys and girls. How many of you wouldn't mind living next to an oil refinery? Okay, I think you're beginning to get the picture. So certainly there are regulatory options. There isn't a one-size-fits-all in terms of controlling pollution risks. So they usually end up on a continuum of some type. At one end certainly is the strict control that I've already alluded to, and the other is, of course, complete freedom. So the EPA uses these mechanisms for trying to decide how much control is needed. Because, as I mentioned earlier, a one-size-fits-all is not necessarily going to work. So certainly when you've got situations like smog in Atlanta or Los Angeles, the smog in Atlanta, for example, is during the summertime equal to smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. That's 60 cigarettes. Wow, you think the smog is bad in Atlanta? I'm here to tell you, it is. How about Flint River, Michigan? Remember the lead in the water? So how much of that is acceptable or okay? So certainly you can see that, how we go about risk management is important, and it's certainly in businesses' interest to be committed to self-policing Otherwise, the government certainly is going to do it for you. The government uses a variety of things, certainly incentive regulations, trying to create financial incentives, tax credits, and whatnot for companies to reduce pollution. Environmental taxes can be imposed on polluting emissions or products. Have you heard about emissions trading programs, sometimes called cap and trade, where efficient companies who are cutting their pollution have air or water quality permits? So they've got, if you will, cleanliness to spare, and so they can sell the unused pollution numbers to those that need additional ones because they can't meet the minimum requirements. So that's an interesting, business, cap and trade all by itself. There are projects to try and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by eliminating carbon. Projects like planting trees, paying farmers actually not to till soil, which obviously lets out emissions that do harm and create the greenhouse effect, and even methane, recovering methane from pig farms. So these are all actions that a company can take to try and reduce its environmental pollution footprint, if you will. Certainly, information disclosure harnesses market forces by getting consumers fired up and aware of their environment and what's going on. The toxic release inventory is a system whereby the EPA has actual notice over the discharge and actually the possession of all hazardous chemicals. And so that's when you hear about the permitting process, whether it be air or water quality or hazardous waste permits. This is the vehicle by which the EPA manages, governs, conducts oversight over businesses that have these problems or issues. Certainly, voluntary regulation without governmental interference or mandate is the ideal, right? Let me give you an example of a company here in South Dakota in Brookings. It's called Daktronics. It makes electronic signboards for sports stadiums and highways and things of that nature. Well, they use a lot of water in the production of these signs. And so, obviously, after the water is used, you would consider it to be, polluted. And you're thinking, oh, man, is this getting discharged into our waterways? Well, on its own volition, Daktronics set up its own internal water cleaning tank system so that zero water is discharged outside the plant. All of the dirty water is cleaned and reused in the plant over and over and over again. And that was something that Daktronics initiated on their own. So that is what I would simply refer to as voluntary regulation. Clearly, the public and the brand of a company, the public makes demands on companies, and I think two of the more proactive companies in publicizing their environmental quality actions, those being BP Oil and Exxon, because they've had two catastrophic incidents in their business history. They've really gone out of their way to try and polish their brand and improve their public image with respect to the environment. So clearly the most responsible companies have an environmental management system that is part of their overall managerial operation. In other words, they are checking, inspecting, and correcting for potential environmental violations. Again, it's something that they would rather deal with than having the government get involved and police them. So companies take, precautionary actions in trying to, again, preempt potential, problems. In your text, the DuPont company, a very large company that deals with a lot of chemicals, took its popular Scotchgard fabric protector off the market when it learned that a chemical that it contained was widely present in human tissue that was exposed to the product. So even though there wasn't a clear, cogent, convincing evidence that there was danger, nevertheless, the company took a precautionary action to prevent a potential serious problem. So certainly the manufacturing of all products involve product life cycles, right? And there's one that we're going to take a look at here in just a moment that was in your text. But certainly, business is going to evaluate revenue creation in products, services, or advertising appeals. It's just good business to be environmentally sensitive. Or, as I asked you last week, how much pollution can a company legitimately engage in? Interesting question, right? Does business have a right to pollute the environment? And so the more proactive companies are checking, inspecting, and correcting to avoid potential state and federal regulatory supervision problems. So companies maintain their own dashboards of indicators as done by Dow Chemical as an example, to try and make sure in a precautionary and preventive way that they do not go overboard or do anything that potentially is going to give them a serious problem down the road. So what do you think of the AMVAC case that was in our chapter for today? Because it certainly raises questions about AMVAC's strategy, which is to buy relatively dangerous pesticide brands in order to milk them for profits as obsolescence and regulatory censure close in the United States. That is, that the use of the pesticides are going to be gradually prohibited. So it poses an interesting ethical issue about, again, so how much pollution can a company ethically engage in? I think that's a profound, question that companies, certainly in terms of their strategic planning, need to ask themselves. So what were, for example, AMVAC's ethical strategic plans? Well, they certainly had a strategy, but was it ethical? Their strategy, of course, was to take these pesticides that were going off the market because they were superseded by better and safer products, and yet the company would take these products and sell them overseas to less developed markets that obviously had lower safety standards and whatnot in developing countries. And so they sought to find new markets in these third world countries to extend the life of the product for the purpose of certainly making money. Is this an ethical problem? Selling a product in a third world country, in a developing country that is legally prohibited because it is dangerous in the United States? I think that's an interesting question. The central issue is that AMVAC sells pesticides that pose risks to human health, wildlife, and nature. Pesticides, we can agree, are inherently dangerous. So that certainly brings into play utilitarian arguments, right? That if the benefits exceed the risks, well then, hey, it's okay to do it if you use the utilitarian approach. So their strategy is to reduce the net benefit in the utilitarian equation because its brands pose a greater risk than those of other manufacturers. Yeah, but they're engaged in a narrow margin of ethical legitimacy, right? And that, well, it may not be illegal yet for them to sell this product, yet, that's coming. And yet they foresee that and are going to milk the product, sell it on any market they can, niche markets and whatnot. So is there a potential net gain using the utilitarian model? Maybe in the short run, but certainly not in the long run. How about this? Do you believe that AMVAC is faithful to its ethics code? And of course, the question that people want to ask is, so what is the ethics code of AMVAC? All right, your text says their ethics code is, and I quote, our efforts are focused on achieving the business and personal ethical standards as well as competence with the laws and regulations that are applicable to our business. What do you think of that? And then it adds and reflects the care of all stakeholders. Does that sound wishy-washy or gobbledygook to you? Well, there isn't any evidence, at least presented in the chapter, that AMVAC has actually acted unethically, but do you think they're headed in that direction with the strategic plan and policy that they have? Does their ethical code raise even broader ethical issues? You may want to look American Vanguard Corporation's code of conduct and ethics because it's a good model. It's a good model. Nothing in the code addresses the ethical issues raised in the case study. It does not define the company's stakeholders, although there's a prohibition against dealing unfairly with customers, suppliers, competitors, and employees, who normally we would consider to be stakeholders, right? Applicators of pesticides are conspicuous by their absence, in that they're not mentioned at all, huh? There's no statement about protecting human health. So the code, if you will, AMVAC's code, is pretty generic in nature. Should U.S. law prohibit AMVAC and others from exporting pesticides barred from use in the United States? Interesting question, huh? Well, there are, a couple of views here on this at least. Progressives, I agree, want to see regulatory standards of developed nations become global standards. In other words, we want third world countries to evolve to our safety standards, right? So that everybody is protecting the environment from greenhouse gases and other environmental problems. That, one country's business behavior certainly can affect others. And some, argue, well, we're trying to impose the sovereignty of the United States on developing nations by trying to get them to be as safe environmentally as we are. I think you can certainly make that argument, but in the long run, aren't we all in the same boat, in the same environmental boat? And what happens in China is going to affect the United States. What happens in the European Union or Africa is going to affect the rest of us. So yeah, using their strategy, AMVAC has made money. Okay, yeah, you can make money selling drugs too, right? But does that make it right? Is the value to society of pesticides, such as these listed here, great enough to warrant the risks they pose. So we're back to, so how much pollution can a business ethically engage in? I think a good starting point certainly is the law. That's certainly within the confines of the law. That is, at a minimum, the legal floor. But the ethical floor, I think we would like to say, is higher than the legal floor and ought to be in the best interest of all people concerned. And especially that's why we have ethical models like the categorical imperative and the utilitarian ethic and others that we've studied. So yeah, it can be a matter of opinion, but I think when you come to the health of children, look in the eyes of children and ask, well, how much pesticide should we expose them to for money? I think the ethical answer presents itself. So if economic and market conditions remain favorable for AMVAC's strategy, would you buy its stock? The ultimate question, right? The ultimate question. So those who certainly prioritize financial gain will buy the stock. Those who prioritize prudence probably won't. What is prudence? It's the ability to deliberate and choose both good ends and good means. A prudent person chooses practical lines of conduct that benefit both him or herself and others. Think that's a good ethical code that AMVAC ought to take a look at? I think so. I think so. I think you might too. Okay, boys and girls, as always, I invite your emails, questions, problems with the quizzes or tests. I get inquiries from time to time. I usually lose most of those arguments because I get caught with errors in the quizzes or tests. So if you find one, bring it to my attention and we will reward you accordingly. So shoot, move, communicate, stay in touch. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.